All right. So we're looking at our day by day here first. So just taking a look at, so this is going to be PFT 119, which is kinesiology of movement. Is it kinesiology of human movement, I think? It might be the full name. But we're looking at kinesiology today. That is going to be our PFT 119 class. For the new folks that are joining us, this is going to be your guys' first mod, but obviously we've got a lot of folks in here who are on their second or third or fourth mods even. And so this is going to be one of our 12-day classes. So in all of our 12-day classes, we always have a midterm because they're our longest classes, so we kind of split them up. And so it'll be days 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and that will be the information that will be on that midterm. And it'll have days 7, 8, 9, 10, 10, and 11, and then that information is what will be on the final. So looking at what this class is, right? Kinesiology is all about how we move and how our brain understands how to move, but also how our muscular system gives us the structure to move, and then how our muscular system actually carries out all of that how with the structure. So it's all kind of connected. Today we're going to be looking at the nervous system, so sort of the control center of everything. Then we'll start to get into the structural stuff tomorrow with our skeletal system. Then we'll follow it up with the muscular system. So you'll notice like the first part of this class actually is where we are going through chapters 2 and 3. Yeah, 2 and 3 of your regular NASM. So this is going to be a review. Some of you have seen this some of this information for the nervous system before. We actually do the kinetic chain a lot in other classes. So these 3 PowerPoints are going to look pretty darn familiar. Then we're going to get into biomechanics and actual kinesiology. So we are going to get into a lot of directional terms and a lot of terms that we use for like movements and biomechanics, right? So we are going to definitely understand the difference between flexion and extension, right? Flexion and extension, right? There's a million different places that we can do it. So we've got elbow flexion, we've got shoulder flexion, we've got cervical flexion, right? We've got lumbar flexion. We've got all kinds of different types of flexion, and all of them are taking place in that sagittal plane, sort of front to back. And then we've got extension, which is the opposite of that, and undoes all of those movements that we just mentioned. So we'll be looking at the biomechanics of those things. Then we'll also be looking at anatomic locations, planes of motions, and things like that. So really the first half of this first half of this class, I always like to tell people is teaching you how to walk the walk. It's going to be a lot of terms here in the beginning, especially on these 2 days, where we are really just kind of setting up your foundation to speak the language of what our muscles are going to do later on. And that's where we actually start to get into some specific joints here. So we're looking at the foot and ankle complex, the knees, the lumbopelvic hip complex, the shoulder, elbow, and wrist. I say elbow and wrist, but really it'll just be pretty much the shoulder. And then we'll mention the elbow really briefly. And then a little bit of the cervical spine up here. And so this is where we're looking at sort of our body parts. And so when I say like cervical flexion, right? We're getting the flexion part. Like I want you to know, I want you to know what flexion is. And so we're going to teach you that in the beginning, but then we're going to look at like what muscles cause cervical flexion, what muscles cause like translation of the neck, right? What are these muscles that actually cause like those movements to happen? And so you've got your sternocleidomastoid right here. You've got your upper trapezius right here. So we look at like, lateral, what's called lateral flexion, which is this kind of side-to-side tilty motion, right? You've got your trapezius muscle here, and you get your trapezius muscle here. And so when this one pulls, this one relaxes. And then when this one pulls, this one relaxes. And so like, it kind of is on this like sort of teeter-totter thing. And that is definitely something we are going to be looking at, right? That is sort of where we're getting our foundational sort of terminology down here in the beginning, and then we're getting all the muscles that perform these common actions we've talked about. I know in other classes, for those of you who've been with us a little longer, we've talked about like anterior tilting versus posterior tilting, right? We've looked at like lateral tilting, and we've looked at hip flexion versus hip extension. We need to understand like what muscles are the prime movers for those movements. That's at the heart of what kinesiology is. And when we understand that, then we can understand it's like, oh, this person's posture is, doing this kind of motion. And so I know that, the muscle here is what pulls the body that way, and that's why they're in that motion. So you see somebody like rounded shoulders, like really bad like this, right? You know that there's shortened muscles on the front of their body pulling them this way, and there's lengthened muscles on the back of their body that aren't pulling them enough to get them back to that neutral posture. And so we need to know what muscles those are, and so we're going to label them in this class. For those of you who have been wondering what muscles do what, this is the class where we really are diving into that. So now, day 2, we're going to have our first piece of homework. That's going to be 15 questions, multiple choice from days 1 and 2. Day 4, we're going to have our second piece of homework. That's going to be 15 questions from days 3 and 4. So you can see we get you homework every other day here. Then we'll have one more PowerPoint, which will give you a day of rest to practice those 2 homeworks, because your midterm is going to be 30 questions. 15 of them are going to be quote unquote familiar, meaning that like there's probably going to be 7 questions or 8 questions from homework 1 or 7 or 8 questions from homework 2. So questions from homeworks 1 and 2 are actually going to be in your midterm. So if you memorize your homework 1 and homework 2, you will be rewarded with a minimum of 50% on the final. And so then if you have also grasped the concept, you shouldn't really have to, when I say final, I meant midterm. You shouldn't really have too much trouble on that midterm. So 15 of them will be new, 15 of them will be familiar questions, meaning you've already seen them. And all the topics will be the same. I mean, like, you'll hit the new questions are basically reworded versions of the same concepts from the other versions. So that is the midterm. And then the same concept is going to happen. Day 7 will be after the midterm. Day 8, you'll get your homework number 3. That'll be 15 questions from these 2 days. Day 10, you'll get your 4th and final piece of homework, which will be from these 2 days. And then we'll have the final exam, which will be also 30 questions, and it will cover PowerPoints 6 through 10. And 15 of those will be from, homeworks 3 and 4, and 15 of them will be brand new from the same area. And that's that. That's sort of where we're headed. You have any questions, Robert? You feeling good about that? You're our lone representative this morning. All right. So let's take a look here at day 1 of kinesiology. So we are looking at, this is going to come out of NASM chapter 2, which is the basic exercise science chapter. This is where you are seeing a whole lot of just like the kinetic chain, right? We're talking about the nervous system, the muscular system, and the skeletal system. That's our big, that's really the main topics of conversation in that NASM chapter 2. So today we are starting with the command center for everything. We're starting with the nervous system. So purpose of this PowerPoint, we got our little intro slides here, is to provide the fitness professional with the fundamental concepts that pertain to the structure, definition, and function of the kinetic chain, aka we are going to talk a whole bunch about the kinetic chain. So kinetic chain, right? These 3 interdependent systems, right? They have to work together. They rely on each other, that are in charge of producing human movement. So it's the human movement system. And so by understanding all of the structures in there and understanding their functions, that will give you a really good base of understanding to understand like how human movement actually operates. So after this PowerPoint, we want to be able to talk about the nervous system. Tomorrow we'll be looking again into the skeletal system, and after that we'll look at the muscular system, which is the one that everybody wants to get to. But we got to talk about the foundation and the control center first. So, all right, so talking again, just kind of going back here at the human movement system, right? Movement's going to be accomplished because of these 3 systems all working together, right? You've got your nervous system, which is controlling everything. Your nervous system is in charge of like gathering information and then like interpreting that information, right? Like when you were a kid, there was at some point you touched something too hot. I don't know what it was. Hopefully it wasn't like a stove, but like all of us have touched something, like we've all had that like learning moment experience at some point in our life where as a child we were like, I'm gonna put my hand on this thing, and it's like that thing's blazing hot, and then your brain goes, wow, that hurt. So then your nervous system goes, ugh, and pulls the hand away, right? So your nervous system is going to like log that information and, you know, keep it for next time. And so the next time you see something really, really hot, if you do touch it, you're going to know how to move the hand away, but chances are your brain's going to go, no, 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 don't put your hands on that, right? Like, and that's what your nervous system's real job is, right? It's in charge of gathering information. So it gathered the information that the stove is hot, right? Like, and then it interpret that information. It's like, okay, well, hot things burn me and make it hard for me to function, you know, like that damages my skin and is painful, right? So it's a bad thing, right? So then it gathered the information, but it also interpreted that information. And then it learned how to like execute the appropriate response, which was stop touching the stove. So that's really what your nervous system's mostly in charge of, right? It's the command center. Take information in, interpret that information, execute responses. But it can't actually be the one to carry out the response, right? It can't actually do any of this on its own, and that's where your muscular system comes in. So your muscular system is the system that is under the control of your nervous system, and it's in charge of like contracting and relaxing to produce movement, right? So your nervous system might say, man, that's really hot. I need to contract my shoulder to externally rotate that hand away and pull the arm back, right? So they're going to perform external rotation, which is this movement here, a term you will know later on. So like boom, right? Pull the hand away. That's great, right? Like your nervous system knows that it can recruit these muscles in the rotator cuff to protect you when you touch something super hot. And so the muscular system is going to go, great, you know, I'm going to contract these muscles. I'm going to contract them really fast. But then you've also got, you know, the problem with your muscular system is if it's under the control of your nervous system, but if it doesn't have anything to actually move, it doesn't really do much. Like imagine you without a skeletal system. You'd just be this kind of wet, you'd be this squishy, lumpy sack, you know, like, and it would like quiver and move around kind of like a jellyfish, but it wouldn't really like be able to produce very much effective, you know, athletic movement, right? And that's where your skeletal system comes in. This is giving you a framework and gives you these like levers that your muscular system can actually contract. So if you imagine like, you know, even just this pair of scissors here, right? These scissors, right? They're two pieces. They're two like separate pieces. You've got like, you know, this one here and you got this one here, right? They're two separate little things. Well, they are attached together at this little pivot point here in the center, right? And so since if I had like a muscle attached here that pulled it this way, right, that would open it up. And if I had another muscle pull attached on the other side, and it would pull it this way. So that arrangement is what allows me to actually manipulate, you know, these long levers, right? These two really long levers here can be manipulated by some external force. And that's how your muscular system interacts with your skeletal system. Your muscular system is going to pull on one side of a bone, and then, you know, a muscle that's directly on the other side of that bone is going to relax. And that's going to allow that bone to move. And two bones are going to come together in places called joints, and those joints are what allow the actual manipulation to happen. Like that's the space where they can kind of move around, right? They're not all just like one solid piece. Like a lot of times you hear, you know, like that what's the old song? It's like the foot bone's connected to the leg bone. If you had one leg bone, that would make it incredibly difficult to move. You'd just be like walking around like this all the time. But luckily, we've got several leg bones, and so they got all these different meeting places, and that allows them to manipulate and bend and move and twist and do all these really, really cool things. And there's different muscles that attach to different parts of those joints and move them in different angles. So your nervous system is also, again, in charge of all of that. It's in charge of sensing information in your skeletal system as well. And so you can see it's a big loop where it is a chain, right? It's like the links of a chain. They're all components and they all have to work together in order to produce effective movement. So let's see those here. So the human movement system, three interdependent systems working together. We like to use the term kinetic chain. We like to use the word human movement system. They're both totally the same thing. They're interchangeable. I think human movement system is kind of the one that describes it best, considering that it's like the system in charge of human movement. But kinetic chain is so good because like it really does kind of describe it. Like it's like the links of a chain, and we've all heard that phrase. You're only as strong as your weakest link. And so like all three of these systems, if there's dysfunction in your nervous system or your muscular system or your skeletal system, it's going to affect those other systems. So the nervous system is the command center, responsible for controlling the movement. The muscular system is under the control, and it's responsible for producing that movement by contracting. And your skeletal system provides the framework to protect those delicate structures, and it gives you the framework to be manipulated by that muscular system that is doing all the contracting, right? So if one or more components is not working the way that it is supposed to, you are going to have dysfunction in your overall kinetic chain, right? All of it must work together. So that is why we have this course, which is where we are going to stutter. I'm going to stutter. I'm the one doing most of the talking. We're going to study structural kinesiology, right? Structural kinesiology, the study of muscles and how they relate to the science of moving. So we've got to understand a little bit of anatomy and physiology in order to understand kinesiology, but those are basically the three main sciences that make up the foundation for personal training, right? You've got anatomy, which is the study of what stuff is. You've got physiology, which is the study of what stuff does. And you've got kinesiology, which is the study of how we as an organism move. So both our muscular and skeletal systems are involved, but they're all under the control of the nervous system. So really, it's just a conversation about the kinetic chain. So when I say kinetic chain, again, kind of going back to it, kinetic means forces, chain means a system working together, and they all have to work together in order to produce human movement. If one of them is messed up, it will mess the rest of them up. So starting with our foundation today, we are first looking at the nervous system. And so the nervous system is going to be a conglomeration of billions of specially designed cells that provide a communication network throughout the body. Now that sometimes when you hear like communication network throughout the body, it doesn't really conjure up images of the nervous system. Like sometimes people they're like, well, that doesn't really describe what it is. And it's like, actually, it really describes it like quite well. Like if you think of picture an old-timey, like this is way before like fire hydrants and stuff like that. Picture, an old school fire truck. If you ever go to like an old museum, you'll see like what the original fire trucks were. And they were drawn by horse and carriage, and they were just these trucks that just had, they would fill them with like a bunch of water. And so like the fire department was a bunch of people who would stand in a line, and they would like fill a bucket and pass it to the next guy, and then they would pass to the next guy, and then they'd throw it on something, and then they'd pass the bucket back, and then the next bucket would come. Like, they didn't have hoses way back in the day. And so like, that's kind of like your nervous system. I mean, you don't really think about it, but that is a communication network that those firemen were creating. They were like passing off, it's a bucket, but imagine if it were a piece of information. It was going from this guy to that guy to that guy to that guy. And then something was happening, and then a response came, and then like the information went back in the opposite direction. That's exactly how your nervous system works. It needs to be able to send information away, but it also needs to gather information first in order to know what information to send away, So one of the most important systems in your entire body, right? It is transmitting and coordinating signals in order to communicate with the external environment. If it's hot, your nervous system is going to pick up on it. If it's cold, your nervous system is going to pick up on it. If it's sharp, if it's heavy, right? All of that information is going to come in and be interpreted by your brain in order to execute, the types of responses that we really want to in order to keep us safe or keep us effective. So when we are looking at it, right, its main job is it's full of these special cells that are specially designed in order to transmit all of that information and those signals. Now, this is the thing. I know I say this all the time, and it always comes up a lot in these 12-day like heavy science classes. But one of my favorite phrases that you just got to remember, if you want to have a deeper understanding of how this entire universe, how everything in the world, down to cells, down to complicated systems like government, everything, if you want to understand how it works, one of the things we have to accept and understand is that function follows form. So like stuff acts a certain way because it is designed and looks a certain way. So like if you have a client who is unhappy because they are overweight, right? They're overweight because their life is shaped in such a way to make them overweight. It is shaped to give them, to have given them at least a calorie surplus over an extended period of time, resulting in weight gain. So the form resulted in a function, right? They're two totally different things, right? Their life is acting a certain way because it's shaped a certain way. Whether that's because of their own habits or sometimes it's genetics. A lot of those things are inherited, but like we have to accept that like your life is designed to give you the results that you're receiving, right? Because that's just a basic rule of physiology. If you look at like why bones are hard, right? It's because they are made of calcium and they're made of all these little tiny like discs that are able to stack really efficiently on top of you. So they're very dense and stiff and hard and they can resist damage. So their form allows them to function as these, as this framework for our body. Your nervous system is exactly the same way. Your nervous system is shaped in such a way that it has all these neurons in it, which we're going to get into in just a little bit. And those neurons can, transmit electrochemical signals. They have special shapes inside of them on their cellular wall that push sodium and potassium in different directions, and that generates electricity. And so their form allows them to function a certain way. And that way is to send information. So my brain is going to go, ow, hot, and move my hand. I know it's kind of a hard to visualize things sometimes because we don't get to like really see all of this happening in real time. We don't get to see this form, and so sometimes it's hard for us to understand this function. But hopefully by the end of this PowerPoint, we'll sort of have it down. So luckily, in terms of form, your nervous system is very well organized, and it's organized. We're going to look at that organization right now. It's organized into two primary components. Now, this actually is going to split down even further, which we're going to come back to later on in this PowerPoint. But the two main components of your nervous system, we go back to this picture here, you can see is your central nervous system, which is your brain and your spinal cord. And this is really like command central, right? Like this is where all the decision making is happening. This is your unconscious and conscious brain. It's all located right here in the actual brain, but some of it's actually in your spinal cord, like there's a lot of brain in the spinal cord that it doesn't get enough credit for. And so like this is the central nervous system. It's where all the decision making happens, whether that's conscious decision like me choosing to raise my hand right now, or if it's unconscious decision like while I'm trying to stretch and then my leg buckles because it doesn't want to stretch any further because it could go, no, you're gonna pull a muscle, let's buckle the knee instead. Like that's still a decision. It's just one that I, wanted to avoid. So that's your central nervous system. And then we've got to be able to get the central nervous, we've got to be able to get the command center to interact with all the stuff that's like super far away, like my fingertips, that is not close to my brain, especially with my freaking long arms, right? And so your peripheral nervous system is going to come in handy here. And that's the communication, that's the network that communicates with your central. And so you can see all these little like nerves that are heading out from the central nervous system, right? Brain, spinal cord, and everything that reaches out from there. That is your peripheral nervous system. It's all along the peripheral part, right? It's in the periphery. It's far away from the central section. So if the decision making is getting made here, it's got to get info from elsewhere in the body. And so that's actually where your peripheral nervous system comes in. This is going to get information. Maybe the hand here touches something hot, and then that's going to travel, from neuron to neuron to neuron to neuron to neuron to neuron to neuron until eventually it gets to the central nervous system. And it's going to travel up to the brain. The brain's going to go, well, last time I touched something super hot like that, I got super burned and I had to wear, gloves and I had to put Band-Aids on my hand, all these like different things. We should move the hand away. That's really dangerous. So then like the brain's gonna go, okay, well, if we were to move the hand away, we need to recruit muscles up here in the shoulder. So then it's going to send a signal back down the spine, and it's going to travel to those muscles in the rotator cuff, and you're going to pull your hand back. And that's exactly what we're looking at there between the central and the peripheral nervous system. Now, there's some more sections to that. The peripheral nervous system is going to divide a couple times, but we'll get into that in just a little bit. Three primary functions that we've already kind of been laying the groundwork for, we've already been talking about, that your nervous system has. Your nervous system does three main jobs, which at this point you probably kind of already got a pretty good handle on. But the first one is going to be called sensory function, right? Again, that's to gather information, that's to sense information. So sensory information, or sensory function rather, is the ability of the nervous system to sense changes in either the internal or external environment. So I know, like, until now I've been using like the burn hand analogy. And so that's great. Like, that's your external environment, right? But there's also changes happening in your internal environment constantly. Like I had breakfast earlier, right? And it's traveling through my digestive system right now. Right now it's sitting in my stomach, because it wasn't that long ago. And so like right now it's taking a little acid bath. It's going to break all that food down into goop. And then eventually, like once it's soupy enough, once it's broken down enough, there's little stretch receptors on the very end of my stomach. And those stretch receptors are like, nah, that's still solid. Nope, keep that in there. Keep, more acid bath time, But eventually what's going to happen is that wet, soupy mixture is going to hit that stretch receptor, and that stretch receptor is going to go, all right, that's goopy enough, right? We can absorb that. And so then it's going to let it pass into my small intestine. And what it'll do is it'll open up this little, what's called a sphincter, and it'll allow it to move into the small intestine. That's my internal environment, but that's still sensory function. That's still a stretch receptor sensing information. And my nervous system, even though I'm not thinking about it, is making a decision going, no, that's still too solid. Give it 20 more minutes, It's like your mom. Robert, did your mom do that? I know you're the only one here, so I gotta ask you solo. But did your mom have like the direct calculations for how long you were allowed to eat before getting into the swimming pool?
Yeah, I don't think she was spot on, but she was always like, yep, 30 minutes, 30
My
minutes.
mom was such a nerd about it. She'd be like, "What'd you have?" And I was like a half a sandwich, like a PB&J. She'd be like, 18 minutes. That's okay. She'd be like, that wasn't a very large meal. She would like do math. Like she'd be like, how big was the meal? And I'm like, she's like, now the 30 minutes isn't gonna cut it. I'm like, oh. But yeah, that's like sensory function, sensory function is taking information in and learning about it, right? Now, the next part that you have is what's called your integrative function. This is where like the thinking part of your brain really comes in. And this is the ability of the nervous system to analyze and interpret that sensory information. That allows for the proper decision making, right? So earlier when I talked about how maybe something really solid was trying to move into my small intestine, and that stretch receptor was sensing that it's really solid, the stretch receptor can't make any decisions on its own. So it was just relaying that information to my brain, and my brain was going, no, it's too solid. Don't open up. Don't open that sphincter, right? Instead, it was just saying keep it closed, right? That decision right there is integrative function, right? The decision to go, no, that's still like too chunky, right? And then eventually it's like, okay, well, here's an update. Now it looks like this. And then the brain goes, oh, well, that's nice and soupy. Great, perfect. Open up the gates, right? And that's integrative function. Again, like sensory information is going up. Integrative function is interpreting that information. Here's a classic example of like integrative function, just using like your memory and logic skills. If I told you that I have an animal in a box, right? This is an analogy I use all the time. I've got an animal in a box, right? You don't know what it is, but here's what I'll tell you. It has feathers, it has webbed feet, it goes quack, and it has a bill, right? You can take all four of those pieces of information, and you're gonna run that past all of your experiences in life. You're gonna be like, okay, feathers. You're instantly gonna be like, all right, it's either a bird or a freaking dinosaur, probably a bird. And then you're gonna go, all right, webbed feet. There's only a few birds out there, so it's either a goose or a duck, right? There's only so many so many birds that have webbed feet. Okay, it goes quack, right? Like that's probably a duck, right? Because geese go honk. I don't know. Now we're getting into stuff I don't know about. But like you're running past that, running that information that you just received past all kinds of like memories and experiences, right? That's integrative function. And then you're gonna, just choose an answer. And that's also part of integrative function. So its job is to interpret the sensory information that's been gathered. If something's heavy, how much muscle needs to be recruited, right? Because your body wants to get the job done with as little effort as possible, right? Your glutes may be able to squat 300 pounds, but if you go to pick something up that's 20 pounds, it doesn't want to recruit all 300 pounds worth of muscle, because then all of a sudden you go to grab something and then leap off the ground, It wants to get things done with as little effort as possible. And so your brain getting information coming in and saying, how much muscle do I need to recruit to get a job done? That's integrative function. If something's hot, or is it dangerously hot, should the arm move away? These are all questions that your nervous system is going to ask itself. And that's integrative. So we've got gathering information and we've got interpreting that information. And then we've got motor function here, which is the neuromuscular response to sensory information. So now that like things have been interpreted, the response is to, hey, move the hand away, right? Or hey, recruit a whole bunch of muscle. And that's the information going away from the brain to recruit whatever it needs to recruit to get the right job done. So its job is to produce movement according to that integrative function. That integrative function was the decision. Now it's time to recruit those decided muscles. If it's heavy, I'll recruit lots of muscle. If it's sharp, let's move that hand in the opposite direction of the sharp thing, right? And here's the thing, your nervous system can be fooled, that's what's so funny about the nervous system. Repetitive movements in the wrong way and learn patterns of moving in a way that we're not designed tricks your nervous system, and it gets used to doing things that it's comfortable doing rather than doing the things that it's supposed to do. And this is where we end up with bad form. We see people, moving a way they're not designed to move, or, we see these freaking smartphones and we spend all day doing this. I'm teaching my nervous system how to get really good at craning my head forward. Like right now, my nervous system is getting better and better and better at learning how to do this, rather than learning how to stand upright and like retract my head back and look forward, I never had this experience. I'll be honest. I'm going to say something that my kinesiology teacher said when he used an example just like I used. I mean, we didn't have, as smartphones were not as popular back then, but like, here's what he said, like, take some time today to actually keep your head upright and keep your eyes forward and look at how much more stuff is in the world than you think it is. And I remember like my fellow students being like, he's right. There's so much more stuff on the horizon than I was always looking just 10 feet ahead of me. It's like, you knew that, Bill. I personally, I didn't have that moment, but I always like to share it in this class and in this moment, because like you might have like, those guys look like their brain was blown. So if I can share that with you, I think that'll be fun. But yeah, keep your eyes up and look at how much more of the world there is, All right, so that's your motor function. It's the neuromuscular response. By the way, here's a really fun just example of all of this, right? Information coming in, interpreting information, information going out. All of that comes together to make up this main concept. I would say like everything we're talking about today is important, but I always like to say if you forget everything from today's lesson, this section right here is in my opinion, the most important thing you're going to learn. So if you take all that information coming in, interpreting information going out, all of that comes together to make up a concept that we like to call proprioception. Proprioception is your body's ability to sense the relative position of adjacent body parts, which is kind of a wordy NASM definition that doesn't really help too many people. But my favorite way to say this is, it is your body's ability to understand where it is in space, right? Like, I got Yoda back there, like sitting on my nightstand, right? And if I close my eyes and I keep my eyes closed, I can walk backwards to about, I'm thinking here, I'm thinking my nightstand. Nope, a little further. Oh yeah, it's close. I know it's right here, right? And then I can reach over and like grab my little dude, right? Like that is because of proprioception. Like I close my eyes, my brain knows how long my legs are, it knows how long my arm is, and it is estimating like how long the bed is. You know, it's not connected to the bed, but like I can definitely close my eyes and like touch my nose super easily, right? And that's because like I have proprioception. My brain is sensing information about my nose and it's sensing information about my hand. And so when it moves there, so we'll do that really easily. I don't have to watch it in order to make it happen. I don't have to guide it there. You know, that's spatial awareness, right? And so like I use spatial awareness to walk to, and you know, my brain's mapping out like a mental picture of how long it thinks, how far I'm traveling when I walk like this, right? And how long it knows my arm is. And so it's not perfect, right? Because I'm not connected to all that other stuff, but it is perfect like when you do it to your own body. Like you think about how difficult it might be to grab something with your eyes closed. Look at how easy it is to touch any part of your body specifically. You could touch things pinpoint accuracy because it's your body. You are connected to it, and your brain knows where this is in space and it knows where this is in space. And so it's able to, you know, use that information perfectly, right? So a really good example of proprioception, right? Like I said, is its ability to understand where it is in space. You think about like training for balance, for instance, like if I'm standing on one leg like this, right? I am altering my proprioception right now, and I'm training to enhance my proprioception right now. So by standing on one leg, right, my brain's getting all kinds of information coming in because now I've got all my gravity shifted to one central point. And if I start to tilt like this, right, there's information coming in, right? I weigh a certain amount and my brain's taking that math in and going, okay, well, since we weigh this much and gravity is pulling us this much, at this angle, we need to recruit these muscles right over here. For this many pounds of force, we need to recruit these muscles over here for this many pounds of force, this muscle for this many pounds of force. I lean any further, right? Now more force needs to be recruited, right? And then like, let's say I want to get back to neutral, it's going to contract some of these muscles to pull me back this way, right? It's going to push further down into the floor with these muscles here. So the amount of force needed to get me back to neutral, my brain doesn't just know that instinctively. It has to learn it slowly over time. And that's why we need to train for balance as trainers. This is why we do so many single-sided exercises and one-legged exercises and things like that. We train to improve our balance and coordination because we are enhancing proprioception. We are giving our body more and more ability to understand its environment and how it interacts with that environment, right? So training proprioception is going to improve your balance. It's going to improve your coordination. It's going to improve your posture. And it's going to allow the body to adapt to its surrounding without having to actually think about doing the movement, you know? So how many times, actually, you know what? Here's a really fun one. We're going to mess with your proprioception here real quick. So this is a weird little, we'll call it an experiment. You can do it at home. But here's what you're going to do. You can take both hands and you're just going to kind of like line your knuckles up. Kind of thread them in each other so that you're not like really causing any damage. Like don't hurt yourself doing this. What you're gonna do is you're just gonna press, and we're gonna press for 30 seconds straight. And you're gonna push in like this for 30 straight seconds. And we'll go in 3, 2, 1. Just keep pushing. And what we're gonna do when we're done with this 30-second press here, right? And you should be quivering a little bit because I want you to squeeze real hard. When we're done with this 30 seconds, I don't want you to just pull your hands away like directly. Keep squeezing, push, push, push. I want you to just very gently try to pull your hands away from each other. All right, keep it up for another about 10 seconds. Push, 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 push. But when you pull just gently, gently away, I want you to feel, it's gonna feel like your knuckles are attracted to each other. So we'll go ahead and relax in 3, 2, 1. And then just very gently pull them away. Does it kind of feel like there's like a magnetic force trying to push your hands together, right? So what we did right there, and you can tell me actually, Robert, did you feel that a little bit? Did you do it?
Yeah, I did. I don't know if I moved them away too fast or if like the fact that you were explaining like that they're gonna feel magnetic, that it didn't feel magnetic, you know?
Okay, fair enough. So
training my
here's one that you can
brain.
also do. Here's another one you can do. This is one that you do with, this is like you do this as kids all the time. Stand in a doorway and press with both of your hands like this into that doorway, but you won't be able to actually move it. And just push, 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 and then step away from the door, and your arms will go like this. It'll feel like your arms are really light, and they'll want to like drift up past your head. And it's kind of just like a fun little brain hack that kind of freaks people out. It's a little fun little party trick. Well, what we're doing right there is we're getting your brain so used to contracting certain muscles that it has a hard time not wanting to contract those muscles once it's done. And so we altered your proprioception. We actually messed with your proprioception. So whenever you contract a muscle over and over and over and over again, that muscle gets really used to being zapped by that nervous system. This is why smartphones are so bad for our posture, is because we are shortening these little muscles here, and we're rounding forward like this. And we're spending so much time in that position, your brain is getting used to that position, and it's starting to learn that that is the new neutral, when in fact neutral should be here. You know, we don't want to be here either. It's not like you're walking around the world like this, right? Like with your neck pulled back. That's also not awesome. We want to be in like neutral. We want our joints, you know, we want them not situated like this. We want them perfectly even on both sides. This is too much to the left. This is too much to the right. I want them dead center. So we want to have like a neutral pull. And we can give ourselves that neutral pull. You'll notice that it says training proprioception enhances your posture, right? Well, by giving your brain the information and the ability to go, I'm not neutral, right? It starts to realize that it can relax certain muscles and get you back to that neutral place. And this is why, for those of you who have been in our other classes, dynamic stretches do have somewhat of a positive effect on posture. They do have somewhat of a positive effect. I mean, obviously, you're not using balance exercises or dynamic stretches to really like super stretch out a muscle, but they do have positive effects on your posture because like they teach your brain where your body is in space. So we know that movement is a response to all that sensory information. We know that it's all dictated by your nervous system. And so this is why it's super important for us as trainers to train in what's called a multi-sensory environment. Big fancy way of saying we want to train in like wobbly environments. We want to get our clients up on one leg. We want to put our clients on Bosu balls and stability balls and RX pads and Dynadiscs and all this really fun stuff. You know, that creates these really positive effects because like when you alter that proprioception, your nervous system has to work that much harder to learn how to interpret information, and it gets your body even better at understanding where it is in space. By the way, highlighting this one more time, just using one more kind of example, if you ever like sit on your leg for 20 minutes and your foot goes to sleep, right? A lot of people will say, you'll hear this all the time, people will say like, oh, you cut the blood flow off to your leg. That's what a lot of people think, right? That is not what's happening. Thank God. Because like if that was what was happening, if you were actually cutting blood flow off to your leg, your foot would suffocate and you would lose that foot. Like that'd be it. Your cells would suffocate just like you suffocate, right? Like so luckily it's not that you're cutting off blood flow to your foot. What you're actually doing is you're actually interrupting the nervous system's communication network with that foot. And so what's happening is when you sit on your foot, you are basically pinching a neuron, and those neurons are now no longer, like you have interrupted sensory information. So like, remember, there's information going towards the brain, there's information coming from the brain, and now you put a roadblock between those two signals. So at first it's fine, right? Your brain's like, it's fine, I'm sure the foot's down there, you know, what's the worst that could have happened? But then slowly it starts to get like my mom, where it's like, okay, he hasn't called in a few hours. Like anything could have happened. There was an earthquake in LA over the weekend. Like, where is he? You know, like, and she's gonna start like panicking, right? So then like eventually she starts sending, like you start sending a bigger signal. So it's like, all right, I'm just gonna send out a text message. Hey, foot, are you still down there? Just making sure you're okay. just checking in. Brain loves you, you know, like, and then no response, right? Because we're, you know, the butt's still sitting on that foot. And so then the brain tries again and goes, okay, I'm gonna try, you know, I'll give him a phone call, right? Tries a little bit of larger signal. Hey, you know, and it doesn't get through, you know, so it has to go to voicemail. That's the analogy just broke down. The metaphor just snapped. But it says, hey, you know, brain just checking in with your foot, just seeing if you're there. But then eventually, you've been sitting on that foot for so long and the signal's been so interrupted. Now the brain, the nervous system is sending huge signals. Like, foot, are you down there? I haven't heard anything in forever. Foot, where the hell are you? You know, like it's just sending these massive signals. But you still don't feel it because you've been interrupting that signal. So then all of a sudden you shift your body position. Now all that information starts to get through and all these pins and needles in your foot start firing like crazy because that's your brain going like, is this part of the foot still there? And the foot's going, yeah, I'm still here. And then it's like, is this part of the foot still there? It's like, yeah, I'm still here. And all that information is going to and from. And so that pins and needles sensation that you're feeling is your nervous system. It's all the information. It's like, you know, it's like when your mom called you and you will come out of a movie theater or something, you've got 6 voicemails. My mom's not actually that bad, by the way, like in case she ever watches this. But no, like when you get like, you know, just a wall of text messages and you're like, oh man, something clearly must have happened, right? That is exactly what's happening when your foot falls asleep. That's all that information finally coming in. And it's all related to proprioception. You interrupted proprioception and your nervous system freaked out. How are we feeling so far? It's been a while since I did a question break. Robert, you feeling good? Questions, comments, concerns?
Yeah, I got a question for you, but I'll wait for it till after class because it's part of the sitting on the leg thing, and I don't want to go too off track.
You're like, oh, we know what happens when you go off topic.
Yeah.
No problem. All right. So let's look at the anatomy here. So we've talked a lot about, like, if we think of all, everything I just said is like a giant intro. Let's get into the actual anatomy. Let's do some labeling, shall we? So a neuron, right, is the what we like to call the functional unit of the nervous system, meaning that your nervous system works because of the shape of neurons and how they interact with each other. So it's what makes up your actual nervous system. Billions and billions and billions of neurons, right? Nervous cells, right? And so you got 3 different types, which makes a lot of sense considering that earlier we talked about 3 different functions of the nervous system. So one of the types of neurons you've got are going to be called sensory neurons. Guess what? They sense stuff, right? Sensory neurons are what we like to call afferent neurons. Or really quickly, pit stop. I want to apologize on behalf of every teacher who has ever had to teach sensory and motor neurons for the terms afferent and efferent, which I know sounds similar, and I cannot imagine how much more similar they sound over a freaking Zoom recording. But afferent neurons, AF, are neurons that are sensory neurons. These are informations going towards the brain. So they are coming from a site and going to the brain, right? So if I grab a dumbbell and I've got it held in my hand, right, my afferent neurons, my sensory neurons, are saying that's a 20-pound dumbbell. And my brain goes, great, last time we lifted a 20-pound dumbbell, this is how much force we used. And we'll come back to that in a minute. But those are your sensory neurons, right? They are going to gather that information and start sending it to the brain. Your motor neurons are going to transmit efferent or efferent nerve impulses from the brain or the spinal cord, and they're going to go to an effector site. So they're going to go to a muscle or an organ or whatever, right? So now sensory neurons went to my brain interpreted that information, and then it used motor neurons to execute a response. So take a look here, sensory neurons versus motor neurons. There's always the classic picture of a sharp tack. Where is it? Come on. There we go. Okay, well, not a sharp tack, but I do drink. Oh wait, no, there it is. All right. So here's kind of like this is an effector site, which is a muscle, and this is a sensory site, which is the tip of the finger here, which is like, here's a very sharp object, right? So that sharp object, sensory neurons, afferent neurons in this finger here are going to gather information, and it's going to travel, up the arm, and then eventually get to the spinal cord here, and then that spinal cord will go up to the brain. And then the brain's going to go, well, move the arm, right? And so the information goes back down, but rather than going, it can't go back to the effector site. The effector site doesn't actually contract anything, right? So it has to go to an effector site, an effector site. Again, I apologize for this. It's going to go to the muscles here in the bicep to squeeze and pull the arm away, right? So sensory information comes in, motor information goes out. And that is how our nervous system is sort of organized there. Now, obviously, like, you don't have like one giant neuron that stretches all the way up your arm and gets the spinal cord and then travels up the brain. So you have to also have a third type of neuron, which are your interneurons. Their job is to go from neuron to neuron to neuron to neuron, right? Like it's like a game of telephone. Like, hey, the middle finger says it touched something sharp, right? And then it gives the information. Eventually, it works its way up to the brain. And so sensory neurons go from goes from a sensory neuron to the brain, and then motor neurons go from the brain to an effector site, and interneurons are from neuron to neuron to neuron. So those are the three main types of neurons that you got. Feeling good about that, Robert?
Yes, I am.
You're getting the solo treatment today. Normally it's like, any questions, anybody? Cool. All right, now let's go ahead and so that's a little bit of the anatomy, right? Those are when we look at the anatomy of your nerve. And I kind of moved through it a little quick, but I'll go back just for a second here. If you look at the anatomy of a neuron, and how it's amazing at being able to do all this, this is what your actual nerve cells look like. They've got this really cool shape, which obviously allows them to do a really cool function, right? Function follows form. And so their shape, you'll notice, look at all these like little fingers that reach off in all these different directions, right? That's what makes neurons so good at providing a communication network, because these little fingers here and these little fingers here are able to wrap around different types of tissues and like interact with each other. And that way, like if I'm holding on to somebody's hand over here and that person pulls this way, right? I get pulled, which means I'm probably going to pull on somebody else over here. So now that information is going to like be shared amongst all three of us, right? That is what's kind of cool about all of this, right? And so this neuron's really good at working with this neuron and that neuron and that neuron. They're all connected, right? Neurons in the brain. Let me see if I can get the type of picture I want to get. Yeah, look at this. This is great. Look at how all of these things are connected, right? This is a very different picture than the one we were looking at. We were kind of looking like a flat picture before. But look at this 3D version, like all this. And then there's just electrochemical signals traveling from place to place to place to place. So they're providing this huge network. And you have billions of neurons inside of your brain. Here's a really fun, weird fact. There are more neurons in your brain alone, not counting distributed throughout the rest of your body. There are more neurons in your brain alone than there are stars in the sky that we can see right now. I had to phrase that specifically because obviously there's definitely going to be more, in an infinite universe. But like in terms of what you can see, you've got way more neurons in your brain. And here's some interesting like looking ones. Here's different shapes of neurons, but you can see they all kind of share the same sort of like, they got that finger shape, right? That allows them to all kind of connect to each other. That's kind of fun. I should save that picture. That's an interesting look. I mean, it's not super, super important, but fun looking. So that's all those little fingers. We're gonna call those fingers dendrites, right? Dendrites are how these little fingers are going to interact with things. Dendrite, by the way, means tree, which is why this kind of looks like the branches of a tree. It means tree in Greek, I want to say. Then you get your cell body. Your cell body has all the normal stuff any cell is going to have. It's got a nucleus, right? Which is going to contain all your information for how to make new neurons. It's got mitochondria for producing energy. It's got lysosomes, which are basically your neurons, like immune system. It's got all the normal stuff that you're going to see in any cell. But it does have this kind of special big long tail here as well. This special shape allowing it to have its special function. And that's what allows it to kind of stretch out. And that will allow it to actually communicate over long distances. So earlier I said, you've got, it's going to go from neuron to neuron to neuron because your neurons really aren't that big. In order to get information from here all the way over here, it's got to go through several different places. Well, you know what's kind of fun? You got one motor neuron in your leg that is actually the entire freaking length of your leg. That is how long its axon is. So, some of them are pretty large. But yeah, generally it's going to go, little tiny little neurons going from place to place to place to place. And that's how we actually code information too, but we'll get into that in other classes. We're not going to spend too much time on that one in this course. So now, earlier I mentioned you've got your central system, you've got your peripheral system, right? Central system is the command center. Peripheral system is sort of gathering all the information to get it back to the command center. Or get information away from the command center. So let's divide that down, right? Let's divide that second section, that peripheral part, into a couple different divisions here. So brain and spinal cord, that's your central. Its primary function is to coordinate and interpret sensory information, right? This is the real thinker here. Now, your peripheral nervous system, when it divides down, right? If we look at it, look at how you can see all these like individual little nerves here, right? Branching out from like your different spinal processes. And so these are the nerves that connect with that central nervous system. They're gathering information, like earlier, my stomach, right? I've got nerves branching out from my spinal cord, which are attached to my stomach. And that's where it's, actually getting all the info to get back up to my brain. And so this provides a connection from bodily organs or muscles throughout the body or skin receptors throughout the body, right? And gets all that information back to the brain. So it relays information to the brain, but it also relays information from the brain. So this is going to divide into two primary sections, which is going to be called your somatic nervous system and your autonomic nervous system. So these two divisions here are related. The reason we're dividing them this way is because we're looking at their function. So your somatic system is the section of the nervous system that is voluntary, right? So when I choose to raise my arm, that's a voluntary motion. That is my central nervous system making a decision to move my arm, traveling down to my peripheral nervous system, which will then consciously and with a choice recruit muscles in my anterior deltoid to raise my arm straight up overhead, right? So that is a somatic voluntary contraction. Now, earlier, breakfast, currently working its way through my digestive system, right? I'm not thinking about that, right? My nervous system is controlling it, right? Saying, no, not ready for moving on yet. Hold on, right? My nervous system's making that decision to move food through or to let it stay. But luckily, I'm not here going, man, it's been a while since I ate that cereal. I should probably move it into my small intestine now. Like I'm not thinking about all of it. That's all automatic, which we're going to call autonomic, right? This is the section of your nervous system responsible for involuntary movement. And we're going to divide this into two sections as well, because your involuntary stuff, I know that like we spend a lot of time in the gym training our voluntary stuff, like we are consciously deciding to move weights, right? That's all very voluntary. But there's so much involuntary stuff that we need to be aware of as trainers. And so this is where we need to look at the autonomic system, divided into two primary sections here, which is going to be called your sympathetic and your parasympathetic nervous system. And they are total opposites of each other. Your sympathetic nervous system is often referred to as your fight or flight system. This is the system that increases your heart rate, it increases your breathing rate, it makes you sweat. All of those like stress responses, that's part of your sympathetic nervous system. So its job is to really like amp up metabolic processes. So, if you start, if you go for a jog, and it's real gentle at first, it's no problem. Your heart rate's going to increase a little bit, and that's all autonomic. But then if you start going uphill, right, you're now working a little harder. And so now suddenly your blood is much more acidic because you're building more lactic acid and your legs are starting to feel heavy, right? And so that's going to run past certain sensory receptors throughout your nervous system, and your nervous system is going to go, oh man, we're making way more lactic acid. We must be working really hard. Clearly we are running from a bear. And so then what it does is it starts recruiting a lot of like stress hormones to make you work harder and run faster, make your heart beat faster, and your muscles, it opens up blood vessels. It does all these like fight or flight responses. Like, all right, well, we're not going down without a fight, right? Or we are going to run away from that bear at full speed. So that's that's part of your autonomic nervous system. That's sympathetic, right? You don't have any control over that. If I said, I can trip your sympathetic nervous system right now, just by triggering like maybe a stressful memory. I want you to think about the last time, it's not that big a deal, but I want you to think about the last time you were walking down a hallway and someone was like, hey, and you were like, hey, and then you look behind you and that's who they were talking to. And you're like, oh God, that's so weird. Like, that little bit of like awkward, like, ugh, and then maybe you get a little like sweaty for a second, right? I want to think about the last time you asked somebody out and they were like, I'm already seeing somebody, right? And you're like, oh, right? Like that little bit of nervousness, that's your sympathetic nervous system as well. It's your fight or flight response. Or just think about the last time somebody said something really mean to you, right? And you were like, cool, now you must die. That is the sympathetic nervous system. Now your parasympathetic nervous system is totally the opposite of that. That's the part of your nervous system that's mostly doing work right now. And that is your rest and digest system. So if the sympathetic part freaks out, the parasympathetic part calms you down. It is responsible for resting and digesting, and it slows down metabolic processes actually. In fact, this is actually what's kind of funny. Here's a question for you, Robert. Do you ever notice that when you have a cold, it is at night that you feel the worst, like right as you're getting ready to go to bed? That's when your nose starts running the most?
If I could think back, yeah, right? Pretty much.
So yeah, you'll hear people describe it. I was like, oh man, this would be crazy if you're the one person that doesn't experience this. But yeah, when you catch a cold, it's always just like it's like worse when you're like winding down for the night, right? And what's kind of funny about that is because your parasympathetic nervous system is shutting down all this stuff that has just been like knocking that cold out all day. like it's been fighting all day to like, keep you functioning and kill this freaking virus that's making you ill. But then like you're about to go into like sleepy town, right? And so your body's like, all right, let's turn off, the recruitment of those muscles. Let's get everything a little groggy. Let's slow it all down, lower the heart rate, lower everything. Let's rest. Let's get the body recovered so we can have another hard day tomorrow, or like, if you've ever noticed how after Thanksgiving dinner, you're always just like laying on the couch like, blah, I'm so sleepy. People will blame that on tryptophan, which is an amino acid found in any protein. Well, any complete protein. Tryptophan, they'll blame it on that because there's high levels of tryptophan. And your body actually does use tryptophan, during the parasympathetic part of your nervous system. But the real reason everybody's like sleepy after Thanksgiving is because your body's like, all right, well, we're going to process all this, the mountain of mashed potatoes that we had, and let's just go ahead and lay down on the couch in order to do it, So that's your rest and digest system. So again, the central system is the decision maker. The peripheral nervous system is sort of the workers that that either carry out the response from the decision maker or give the decision maker information. That peripheral system is going to divide into the automatic part. Into the somatic part, which is the voluntary part. So when you decide to do something, it is under the control of your somatic system. And it's going to do the autonomic part. And the autonomic part is the involuntary section. And the involuntary section is going to divide into the freaks out section or the calms down section. And those are sort of the divisions of your nervous system. Okay, so we've talked a lot today about like gathering information. And so now we need to kind of label out some of those pieces that are actually gathering that information, right? I said they were neurons, right? And they are, but there's different types out there. And so this is where we have to talk about like what sensory receptors are. Sensory receptors are these specialized structures that are taking stimuli, heat, light, sound. Usually, in our world, it's tension, gravity, things like that. And they're turning it into sensory information for our brain to actually interpret. The example I always use is like whenever people are talking about, sometimes people will talk about sensory receptors without necessarily realizing it. But you'll hear this conversation if you're at a bar, it's usually like somebody thinking that they're being deep. They'll have this conversation where they're like, how do I know that like my blue is the same as like your blue? It's like, like what if my blue is your green? And it's like no. For the record, like if you're colorblind, sure, you've got different cones in your eyes, but like you have what are called sensory receptors throughout your whole body. The ones in your eyes are in these little cone shapes. We call those cone-shaped receptors. And we can measure them. Yours and mine, they're all about the same size, about the same shape. And that is how we know that your blue and my blue are pretty much the same. Unless you're colorblind, in which case your cones look a little very different from mine. You might be missing some, or they might just be totally differently shaped. And that's why there's different types of colorblindness out there. But that's the thing we know. And so it's like, no, you're blue. They're essentially the same. So that's sensory receptors in your eyes. Those are called photoreceptors, by the way, the ones that are in your eyes. You've also got all kinds of other different types, right? You've got stretch receptors, like the ones I was talking about in my stomach earlier. Those are stretch receptors, right? They are sensing how much stretch is being placed on this little like ring-shaped thing that leads to my small intestine. And so those are sensing stretch. You have got chemoreceptors, which are sensing chemical changes when you eat something salty or sweet. There are taste buds, right? And they're sensing like chemicals, and they're like, oh my God, that's totally tasty, right? Whereas like if it was something that is like not food, like Windex, if that gets on your tongue, your tongue's chemical receptors are going, that is not food, spit that out, So you got all kinds of different ones. And then you got nociceptors. These are an interesting one. Nociceptors are pain receptors. They're running throughout your whole body. And they only get kicked on once you reach like a certain threshold. And so, let's say it's here. Let's say you do something like somewhat painful. If it goes like this, it doesn't really trick those pain receptors. But if it gets past here, all of a sudden you're like, ow, and those are your nociceptors. So sensor receptors are special structures that sense information for the brain to interpret. Now, we could spend all day talking about them, and I love talking about them, so we really could spend all day. But really the ones that we're going to spend our time talking about are what are called mechanoreceptors. And so you can think about like the word mechanical or like physical, right? Like tangible, touchable. And these respond to mechanical forces, touch, pressure, acceleration, deceleration, stuff like that. So mechanoreceptors are receptors that sense mechanical changes, right? If a muscle is being stretched, how does your brain know when to like pull back in the opposite direction and stop stretching? Well, it's able to do that because of mechanoreceptors. How does my brain know that my arm is fully extended directly out away from my body right now? Now, you ask somebody off the street, it's like, hey, describe to me how my brain knows that I'm holding my arm out right here. And they'll usually give you a pretty basic answer where they'll go, you're the one in control of your brain and you're telling it to do that, so that's how it knows. Great. That's half the equation. Yeah. So my brain created information that traveled away, recruited this muscle, right? Here's the thing though. How does my brain know it happened? That's mechanoreceptors coming in, right? So how does my brain, like, yeah, my brain told it to happen, but like I've told people to, move their car in the morning and it didn't happen. Like I've told people to do plenty of things that didn't happen in the end. How do I know it actually got done, right? That is information going in both directions. And that's going back to our concept of proprioception, right? So when I pull my arm away like this, right, my brain is sending information away. But now information's coming back to my brain, and this muscle right here, my anterior and medial deltoids, right, are sending information to my brain saying, hey, we are contracted about halfway right now. And so because they're being contracted about halfway, my arm is extended about halfway away, right? And so then my brain goes, awesome, the arm is in the position that I told it to be in, right? And so those are thanks to mechanoreceptors, these sensor receptors that sense changes in the length of a muscle or how much tension's in a muscle, right? Or maybe how much it's accelerating or how much it's decelerating. And so the two main types of mechanoreceptors we're going to spend our time talking about today. And for the record, there's a lot of them. There are way more than just, actually, this shouldn't be here. This should be, sorry. There are way more than just these mechanoreceptors here, but the two primary ones we're going to spend our time on are called muscle spindles and Golgi tendon organs, and these live in your muscles. Remember, your nervous system and your muscular system, they work together. So your muscular system houses some nervous system materials, and so one of those is what's called a muscle spindle. And this is a mechanoreceptor that is sensitive to changes in the length of your muscle and also like the rate of change of that muscle, right? And so this helps regulate contractions thanks to, what we call a stretch reflex, right? So basically, when a muscle spindle is stretched, an impulse is immediately sent to the spinal cord, and it responds in about 1 to 22 milliseconds. That is crazy fast, and the more often you do it, by the way, the faster it gets. So this is designed to be like a protective mechanism. Your muscle spindles are in charge of basically protecting you from overstretching and tearing a muscle. So like if I were to go from here and just open my arms up super fast like that, I just stretched out my pectoralis muscles, which are in charge of contracting this way. Well, I went in the exact opposite direction. So I just stretched these muscles like crazy. And I did it super fast, right? And I felt a big stretch right here when I did that, by the way. So that is because muscle spindles are running throughout my muscle. And so all of a sudden, when the length got super long, they sent a signal to my brain, and my brain went, whoa, that got super stretched out really fast, right? And so then what it did, you might notice I kind of bounced back to here after every rep, right? And so that right there, that big bouncing motion, that is my nervous system contracting those muscles in order to protect them. This is why we like to do nice, long, slow stretches when we're really trying to get someone's muscles to relax. We want to move slowly so that we don't trip that acceleration factor where the nervous system goes, too long, too fast, We want to go, all right, okay, I'll let it relax a little bit. We want to let it relax slowly and get some actual length. So muscle spindles, that's part of like sending information to my brain so that my brain knows where it is in space, right? Again, if I raise my arm like this, right, my anterior deltoid, this muscle right here in the front of my shoulder, my medial deltoid right here along the side of my shoulder, that is in charge of helping me raise this arm up like this, right? So if it contracts about halfway, my muscle spindle is going to send that information to my brain and say, brain, the medial deltoid is about 50% contracted. And my brain's going to go, awesome, that's exactly where I want it to be, right? Now, here's the thing about muscle spindles. They are often dirty, filthy liars. They often tend to get what we like to call overactive. They experience overactivity very, very, very easily. And what overactivity is basically a muscle spindle saying, hey, we're at full length, when it's totally not, It's totally got more room to stretch, but it sends a signal to the brain saying we can't possibly stretch any further. That's what we like to call an overactive muscle. And you make this by basically sitting in the wrong posture for extended periods of time. If you're sitting like this, right, and then you do it for like you're typing on the computer, 8 hours a day, and then all of a sudden you're done for the day, and you try to stand up and you're like, oh God, that's stiff, right? The reason that's stiff is because that muscle spindle is going, no, 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 no. We had a deal. We wanted to be at this length. You're trying to take us to this length. I want to be at this length, right? When it's designed to be here. That's an overactive muscle spindle. And so it starts sending sort of a pain signal to the brain, right? Or it tells the brain to make a pain signal rather. It says like, hey, if you stretch any further, we're going to tear. So you need to get this Yahoo upstairs to stop trying to stretch us out any further. So it's sort of like your unconscious brain interacting with your conscious brain, right? Saying like, where you start to experience pain, you go, ooh, yeah, that's kind of painful. And then you back off, right? And that is like where we stretch overactive muscle spindles, right? Now, you do have one other you have one other mechanoreceptor here called a Golgi tendon organ. These live in your muscle as well, but rather than being in the muscle belly, like the whole length of the muscle, the Golgi tendon organs actually live in your tendons. So when you look at like a muscle spindle versus a Golgi tendon organ, when you look at that, your muscle spindle is sort of running throughout the whole length of the muscle here, right? You can see it wraps around the fibers, and so when the fibers get stretched out, the muscle spindle gets stretched out, and that's how that sensory information is coming, right? So here's a stretched muscle spindle, here's a relaxed one, and here's a contracted one, right? Where like they've got plenty of space. Like muscle spindles love to be in a contracted state. It's when they get stretched that they start kind of creating that pain signal. But your Golgi tendon organs, they live right here. So when your muscle actually becomes a tendon and then inserts onto a bone, this is where your Golgi tendon organs live. And their job is to sense tension. So if you think about the muscle spindle is trying to protect the muscle from getting overstretched and tearing throughout the belly of the muscle. The Golgi tendon organ is there to protect from tearing the muscle off the bone. It's in charge of sensing how much tension's there, right? Like, lots of tension, So they're sensitive to changes in muscle tension and then also the rate of tension change, just like muscle spindles were sensitive to changes in length and rate of length change. So if and like I said, they're located in the tendon, right? So when you activate a Golgi tendon organ, it does kind of a similar thing to the muscle spindle, which is it kind of freaks out and says like, hey, there's lots of tension here, you should totally like relax so that we can reduce that tension. So the muscle spindle's like response to overstretching is to contract the muscle. And the Golgi tendon organ's response to being overstretched is to relax the muscle. They kind of work opposite of each other. But at the same time, they're doing a very similar process. They're both sending information to your brain for your brain to interpret. So going back to my example here, right? My medial deltoid is like, hey, brain, we're at 50% max length, right? Meanwhile, my Golgi tendon organ is saying, hey, brain, we're at like 10% max tension, right? There's not a lot of tension here, right? We're not being like super stretched out in the opposite direction. There's very little tension. We're in a very safe place, right? So then my brain is going to go, okay, if it's 10% max tension and it's 50% max length, and I'm experiencing this much gravity, the arm must be in this position, right? If it has feathers, if it has webbed feet, if it has a bill and it quacks, it's a duck. If my medial deltoid is at 50% tension and 10% tension, 50% length, it's in this position. By the way, these are fake made-up numbers. Don't put any stock into the 50-10 thing. But that kind of gives you an example of how proprioception works. Your brain gets information from things like Golgi tendon organs and things like muscle spindles and uses that information to interpret what position the body is in. Now, one concept that we are going to come back to in later classes is where when you put pressure on a Golgi tendon organ, whether that's by stretching a muscle out like crazy or actually pushing on it and putting physical pressure on it with like a foam roller or a lacrosse ball or something, or a massage gun, that will actually inhibit an overactive muscle. So if you have a muscle that's like crazy overactive and it's firing like crazy, a Golgi tendon organ can tell a muscle spindle to relax. It can actually inhibit it. They're actually connected to each other. So if you start stretching a muscle out, right? Like if I go here and I start stretching my muscle out like crazy, my muscle spindle starts going, whoa, 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 we're getting to full length here, right? And so it starts freaking out, and I start to feel tension in that muscle. And so it's like, blah, 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 it starts freaking out. It's like, brain, stop stretching, contract the muscle so that we don't stretch any further. And meanwhile, the Golgi tendon organ is also there, and it's being pulled as well. And it's like, yeah, I get, yeah, it's like the muscle spindle's screaming, and so the Golgi tendon organ just kind of starts going with it. But after about 30 seconds, if you continue to put pressure on that Golgi tendon organ, finally the Golgi tendon organ decides to go, all right, look, the solution here is not to contract that muscle. The solution is to relax that muscle. Shut up. And so it literally inhibits that muscle spindle and makes it be quiet, and it shuts down. And that's why when you're stretching for about 30 seconds, you'll notice all of a sudden it relaxes and you can stretch a little further, right? And that's why we hold our stretches for about 30 seconds, at least our static stretches. We have a name for that process, that shutting down process. We call that autogenic inhibition. We'll come back to that in later classes. Now, the last sensory receptor I do want to mention here are your joint receptors. So obviously, your muscular system's working with your nervous system. Well, we also got to make sure that our skeletal system works with our nervous system. And so joint receptors are here to respond to things like pressure or acceleration or deceleration of your joints. So when your joints, are experiencing like, if there's not enough space between the joints and they're feeling a little packed in there, joint receptors are going to send that information to the brain. Or if your joint is moving super fast, that's going to send information to the brain. So again, it's another form of like sensory information for your brain to interpret. These are special things, Ruffini endings, Pacini and corporate. Don't worry about those titles. NASM kind of loops them all up, rightfully so, and just calls them joint receptors in general, because they all kind of do the same thing. They're just ever so slightly different from each other. So those are your mechanoreceptors. Those mechanoreceptors are what give you that proprioception. So the big thing that's really cool is like, you're going to notice like when you first start working out or when your clients first start working out, they're going to get way better at stuff pretty rapidly in the beginning. And a lot of that is just because their nervous system is getting so much new information and it's learning rapidly. It's learning all this new information. And so early improvements in the body actually start with your nervous system. And I love this when I'm working with my clients. They'll come in for a workout and they'll be super hard, and then they'll come in the next workout and they're like, that felt so much easier. I must be getting way stronger. And it's like, you are getting way stronger. They're like, it's funny because I looked in the mirror and I felt like I could see my abs. It's like, okay, well, it's not because your muscles got larger, it's because your brain got better at the movement. I mean, for the record, I never actually say that to my clients. Like, I'm like, yeah, totally. But it's early improvements are definitely because your nervous system gets better at a movement. Oh God, I'm gonna sneeze right at the end of the PowerPoint. Hold on. We're back. All right, so summarizing everything up. Thank you. Summarizing everything up. 3 primary components that make up the kinetic chain, right? The nervous system, which is the command center, the muscular system, which is sort of the worker horse, and the skeletal system, which is providing you with the framework. Your nervous system is billions of cells that all work together to gather information, interpret that information, and execute responses. And so gathering that information is thanks to your sensory receptors. The ones we deal with as trainers are mechanoreceptors. There's the ones that sense length, there's the ones that sense tension, and there's the ones that sense acceleration, pressure, and deceleration. All that information comes together to develop this main concept that we call proprioception, our body's ability to understand where it is in space. So if your body more effectively understands where it is in space, it can more effectively respond to that information. And that's really everything we got about the nervous system. Robert, I know you've seen a lot of this information before. This is just a slightly different take on it compared to other classes. But hopefully you found it helpful. Do you have any questions today? I know you said you had the one, but maybe that's is that an on-call question or an off-call question?
Probably like an off call, because there's some terms in there that I'm sure the new folks probably won't get.
Gotcha. Yeah, let's tie it up. So that is about all I got for you guys today. This is going to be up on Canvas. We're also going to be doing our 5:30 call tonight. So for anybody who, is seeing this and decides you also want to sit on the call, you guys are always more than welcome. But I will see you guys for tomorrow when we get into the stuff we all want to talk about, which is the muscular system. So that will do it. See you guys tomorrow.